Greetings gamers, my name is Anto, and over the last year I've been diving into Pathfinder 2nd edition, moving over from 5e, and I've been documenting my whole process of it. So if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe for more PF2 content. But today I want to answer your questions about the system. I recently asked in a community post what questions people have about Pathfinder 2nd edition, and today we're going to run through them and talk about some of the things that you wanted to know. We're going to break this down into a couple of distinct sections. There are timestamps below the video here so you can jump around for whatever you're looking for, but let's dive into it. Now, we want to start with getting into Pathfinder 2nd edition. There are a lot of questions relating to getting into Pathfinder 2nd edition. And the first question that I want to talk about is from Bob over on my Discord, and it says, what's the worst aspect of PF2? And for me, I think the worst aspect of PF2 is perception of difficulty. So the core rulebook is absolutely huge. It's 600 and something pages, and that's really intimidating to a lot of people. And I think that that is one of the worst aspects of Pathfinder 2nd edition, because you don't actually need to read all of those 600 rules. You barely need to read a small slither of that to understand the system. This graphic here shows a breakdown of what percentage of the book is dedicated to each thing. And you can see that if you are a player, you want to read the play in the game section, obviously. But then at the start of both the class and the ancestry section, there's a splash page that shows you kind of a rough overview of what each of the options are, what they're all about, what their core features are. And you want to look at those two pages, decide on your ancestry, decide on your class based on those splash pages, and then just read the section on your specific ancestry and your specific class, read the play in the game section. And if you are not a spellcaster, you can ignore all of the spell section. You can ignore a huge part of the book. If you're not a game master, you can ignore the introduction to Golarion. You can ignore the game mastery section. The core rulebook is great value for money because it gives you the complete game experience in one book, but it does put a lot of people off for how thick it is, even though they're actually going to read not a huge amount more pages than they would if they were picking up the 5th edition Player's Handbook, just because there's a bunch of extra stuff in here that isn't actually for players. Luna Foxfire says, I'd love to know some of the mechanical differences between Pathfinder 2nd edition and D&D 5e. I have a whole video on that, which I will pin in the card up here. You can check that out. It goes over all the high-level differences. Spartan Atreyu says, do you have an easy playlist for people to watch to transition into PF2? I do have a playlist of all the PF2 videos I've made, and a lot of them are comparing 5e and PF2. That'll be hopefully linked in the card. If not, it'll be in the video description. Andrew Downing says, can someone realistically teach the game to others solely on reading the core rulebook and watching YouTube videos if their only experience is with PF1? And then there's a couple of other questions about how to get into the system. I've just bought the Humble Bundle, where do I start? And questions like that. And to all of those folks wondering how to get into the system, the best place to start is the beginner box up here. I have a whole video comparing it to the 5e one, but the TLDR of it is it's an incredible walkthrough of first time play for the PF2 system. It has everything that you need both as a player and as a GM. There's a solo game in there for you to be able to understand the core gameplay loop, even if you don't have a group necessarily straight away. And everything is labeled and pointed out in such a way that it makes it really easy to learn. If you are a long-time TTRPG veteran and you feel like you don't want to go through that structured experience, picking up the core rulebook or reading the rules online for free on the Archives of Nethys will work, but I do recommend you pick up that beginner box just to get your head wrapped around the system. Rooster's Place says, I need to learn the lore of G-World, Golarion, the official setting of Pathfinder. Any thoughts on getting proficient enough to elaborate on it to my players? So the core rulebook has got an introduction to the world of Golarion, and then there are two other books that I think are really useful if you want to play in that official setting. The first is the Golarion World Guide, the Lost Omens World Guide. That'll give you an introduction to the high level information for a lot of the nations, a lot of the politicking, a lot of the world events and stuff like that. And then the other is the Lost Omens Travel Guide. This was my favorite book of 2022. I made a video on it up here. it covers a huge slice of day-in-the-life style information for the people in the world of Golarion. This, I thought, was much more useful as a game master for understanding how to convey what the setting is actually like in day-to-day terms to my players, rather than giving them a whole big lore dump. Then we had a whole bunch of questions about spellcasting, things like, please tell me Pathfinder doesn't use spell slots, or how to replicate 5e's classes like flexible spellcasting for a wizard. So Pathfinder does use spell slots for the wizards specifically and other prepared casters. It uses the Vancian casting system, so the premise is you memorize specific spells at the start of the day to cast. So if you are a 3rd level wizard, you would have access to a couple of 2nd level spells, and at the start of the day you would assign specific spells to those slots. So let's say you've got 2 spell slots of 2nd level. At the start of the day you choose specific spells to go in those slots, and those are the spells you have for the day. This is different to 5e's version, where you just have 2 2nd level slots and you can cast anything you have available to you. But it's really not as big of a deal as it seems when you first read it. When you come from 5th edition and you read the way that Pathfinder 2nd edition handles prepared casting, it's natural to be like, oh, that's more restrictive than what I play, I don't like it. But in my experience, for most of the time, wizards have kind of a specific selection of spells that they take every day anyway. So really, you're going to fill up most of those slots with your mainstays, and then you'll just have a few slots where you're making kind of more like a decision point around those other spells. There are also a bunch of rules to help you navigate around this. There are certain feats and abilities that allow you a little bit more flexibility, and then in the Secrets of Magic book there is an entire alternate casting system that makes it much more like 5th edition spellcasting. Then we also had a bunch of questions about multiclassing. How does multiclassing work? What are the archetypes and how do those work? And the way that this system works is anytime you would get a class feat, so depending on your class you'll have a table of options and it will tell you at what levels you get class feats. Anytime you would get a class feat, you can instead choose an archetype feat. Now you always start with the dedication feat, which is a 2nd level feat. You don't have to take this at 2nd level, it is just a level 2 feat, so you can't take it before, but you can take it anytime you get access to a class feat after 2nd level. So let's say you want to be an assassin. Assassin is one of the archetypes in the game. When you have access to a class feat from 2nd level, you can choose the Assassin Dedication feat. There are a couple of prerequisites for this depending on what the dedication feat you want to choose, what your archetype is going to be, but these dedication feats give you a couple of smaller benefits relating to the archetype that you're choosing. If you're choosing a fighter, for example, you'll get some of the core fighter features in this dedication, and then from there you can go ahead and you can choose further feats in that archetype tree. An important thing to note is you don't have to choose all of them. So for example, with our assassin, there is a 10th level assassin feat called Angel of Death. The only prerequisite in that is that you have to have the assassin dedication, which is how you dip into the archetypes. So at level 2 you could take the assassin dedication, and then you could take nothing in the archetype of assassin for the next 8 levels until you get to level 10, and then you could take Angel of Death. You don't have to go up sequentially unless the prerequisites tell you. And then we had a whole bunch of questions about specific rules in PF2, so we'll run through those quickly. Sanders says, how does handing out XP work in the game? So the way combat experience works in PF2, specifically for combat, because that's the most common way you're going to get XP, it's not the only way. So you will have an encounter budget, so you decide whether you want your encounter to be a low difficulty, moderate, or severe, and that will give you a number of XP. So if it's a moderate encounter, it will give you 80 XP, and then you spend that based on the level of the creature in relation to the party. So something at the party's level, let's say the party are level 3, a level 3 creature would cost 40 XP in that encounter budget. A level 2 creature would be 30 XP, a level 1 creature would be 20 XP, but it's all in relation to that party level. Then you build out your XP budget and you get the overall amount for that encounter. So for a moderate on, it would be 80 XP. This broadly works the same for all things, all other threats, all other traps, social encounters, all that kind of stuff, it's all keyed into how difficult is it in relation to the party's level versus an intrinsic amount of XP tied to each thing, like the way 5th edition does it. Daniel Rice says, what are the rules that everyone ignores in PF2? Like the 5e exhaustion or jump rules, there seems to be rules for everything in PF2 and many of them do not add to the experience. Like the healing minigame you have to play after an encounter. Do people do that? Keep rolling dice to see how many hours the medic packs took for everyone to get back to full? Do people even track that? So I like to play by the rules as much as possible, especially in games like D&D and Pathfinder, which are fairly heavy rules games. You know, you can get a lot of like one-page rules where you don't really need to worry about specific mechanical interactions. But once your rulebooks start getting into the hundreds of pages, I find it best to play by the rules as much as possible until I've got an experience with them and know what I like to change. So like in 5th edition, you say here that people ignore the exhaustion rules. Personally, the exhaustion rules are one of my favorite rules in 5e. I implemented a whole bunch of homebrew tweaks that brought the exhaustion rules more into play because it's an interesting dial to turn in terms of difficulty and consideration and things like that in combat and outside of combat. In Pathfinder 2nd edition, you specifically mentioned the healing minigame. So for those that aren't aware, healing works really differently in Pathfinder 2nd edition than it does in D&D 5e. There are no short or long rests in PF2. There is an 8-hour rest, which allows you to recover your constitution modifier multiplied by your level in HP. And that is something that is really different to 5e. It's much harder to recover HP over time than it is in 5th edition, and I know my players, the first time they encountered that, they really stopped them because they were used to being able to charge into a situation, then pop a short rest or a long rest, be fully recharged and go at it again. You can't do that in PF2 without using some of the other systems such as the healing, the kind of medicine checks, which give you the opportunity to recover some hit points, but not necessarily guaranteed, as well as healing potions and things like that. I'll make an assumption about reading this comment is I'm going to assume that you've only played low level play at this or you haven't played at all. This will change as you level up because you're adding your level to your HP that you gain when you rest, and you get better at things as you level up. So if someone is using medicine to recover wounds between combats, as you level up, you're going to get better at that. You're going to hit the DC threshold for that easier, going to more reliably recover HP. But then there is also another couple parts of it. First is that at low levels, you should be close to death when you're encountering these monsters. You know, these monsters are the kind of things that tear apart commoners who you were up until recently when you started off on your adventure in life. So it promotes a slightly slower, more methodical approach to entering into combat, which is, I think, a little bit more reminiscent of some of the old school D&D vibes when you had to really be careful with your life or bring a lot of retainers to swap out to or send in front of you. And then there is also the magic element to it. So in 5th edition doesn't assume that there are a lot of magical items in the world. It doesn't assume that you're going to be able to buy magical items, and it doesn't assume that they're going to be easy to obtain. Pathfinder 2nd edition, complete opposite. Magic is everywhere. It is a high magic system. So pretty much as soon as you get access to gold, you're going to be able to start buying healing potions, and you want to bring a stock of them because healing potions, spells, wands, all that kind of stuff, that is going to be your bread and butter for mid-combat and between combat healing. Especially if you don't have the time or you don't want to spend the time sitting down and doing multiple medicine checks to recover small amounts of HP. Simmons Lucas says, your thoughts on runes? I really like runes. So the way runes work is runes are a magical item that you apply to a weapon or your armor or another item that gives it new properties. The most common version of them are potency runes that you're going to put on a weapon to make it a +1 sword. So instead of finding a sword that is specifically a +1 sword, they do exist, but you can give your players a +1 rune, which they can apply to any weapon, and then that makes it a +1 weapon. There are all kinds of other runes that give you extra damage dice or extra damage types, depending on what you want. So if you are a player that wants to build a specific kind of weapon, runes are a really great way to do that, to give you the flexibility to say, right, I want this flaming magical sword, I can apply this to any sword if I have the runes. As a game Master, it allows you to drop useful mechanical buffs to your players without having to give them specific weapons. So this happened to me a lot in both in Pathfinder 1st Edition and in D&D 5e. When I wanted to give the players a specific buff, you tie that buff into a weapon, and then anytime the players encounter another weapon, they have to choose, well, do I want to keep this cool sword or do I want that cool sword? With runes, you have a lot more flexibility to say, right, okay, I'm going to keep one rune from this and take one rune from that and put it on a third sword to make this even cooler option that I really like. So Flip asks, what is the difference between normal spells, ritual spells, and focus spells? So normal spells are the kind of spells that you'd be familiar with 5e. They go into slots, they have levels, you cast them as you would expect to cast them in 5e. Ritual spells are slightly different, they take longer to cast, and most of them require multiple people to be able to perform. You have a primary caster, who's the person casting the ritual, and then in most cases you have to have secondary casters. These people don't need to be able to cast the spells, but they are there. If you think of it like in a lot of movies where you see someone reading out of an ancient textbook and there are other people that kind of repeat what they are saying, it's important to have the bodies and the repetition there, but only one person is actually casting the ritual spell. They tend to take a lot longer to cast than normal spells, but they have more interesting, varied, and powerful results. And then focus spells are kind of a distinct thing from regular spells. You get them usually from either doing a specific kind of study from one of your gods or from like a specific ability. Not everybody gets them, and they have their own pool of resources, focus points that you use to cast them. So Cafe says, what are traits? Traits are the way that Pathfinder conveys a lot of information in a small amount of space. So anytime you have a rule that is the same across multiple instances, a lot of the time that will be a trait. So for example, when you make an attack in PF2, chances are that attack is going to have the attack trait. All this does is let you know that this specific action has some additional rules tied to it. So for the attack action in particular, an ability with this trait involves an attack. For each attack you make beyond the first on your turn, you take the multiple attack penalty. So this is the system's way of saying, hey, this thing that you're doing technically is an attack, so it will give you a multiple attack penalty. So that might apply for certain actions that aren't directly attacking someone, but that take a similar sort of amount of effort or will provoke similar kind of mechanical impacts. So it's just a way for the system to convey a lot more information in a lot smaller space. It does mean that when you first start playing, you're going to have to be looking up the rules a lot, because you'll see specific abilities or monsters or feats that have traits that you don't necessarily recognize or understand, and you have to go and look those up. But as you get into the swing of things, it makes processing the information much faster, because you'll see something and let's say you've got an opportunity to do something that has the attack tag, even though it's not an attack. You go, oh right, okay, I know if I do this and then I want to hit someone, hitting them is going to be harder because of that multiple attack penalty. Another question from Kuffa is, what is a flat check? A flat check is you just roll a single d20, don't add any modifiers or penalties to it, and you compare it to a DC. Flip says, with how many modifiers and the slightly more crunchy skill checks, should you try and limit them as to not to slow the game down, or do they get quite fast to do? So the way modifiers work in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is you're going to have item, situational, and status bonuses, and they come from specific things and they don't stack. So at any one time you're only going to have a couple of modifiers applying to a specific thing, and a lot of those apply over time. So as you level up, all of your numbers are going to go up, but they'll stay that way for the rest of your level. Those floating modifiers, those are only going to come in based on situation and circumstance. So let's say you move into a flanking position, you're going to get a bonus because you're in that position, but you only need to remember it while you are there. Certainly in my experience, it doesn't really slow things down all that much, and it's not very often that you have to sit there and do a lot of math to say, right, okay, I'm getting a +2 from here and a +1 from there, but a -3 from here, so what do I get overall? Most of the time you're just gonna get some bonuses, or you're just gonna get some penalties, and it runs perfectly quickly. Sun says, how does the hidden and stealth system work? So unlike in 5th edition, in Pathfinder you roll initiative based on your perception check, not your dexterity dexterity. So by default, you are going to be rolling initiative using your perception skill, but there are some instances where you can use other skills. One of the most common is using stealth. So if before combat starts you are in a stealthy position, you are hidden, you are obscured from view, all those kinds of things, you might use stealth instead of perception to roll your initiative, and that allows characters to really make the most of their skills. In terms of stealth and hidden, that plays into kind of a tiered system when it comes to stealth. So if you are hidden from something, you are not necessarily undetected by it. They might still know you're in the region, they might not just be able to see you, whereas if you are completely undetected by something, they don't know you're there. An important thing to note about the difference between kind of hiding in PF2 versus 5e is the hide check, which is an action in PF2. That is a roll made by the GM in secret. So you say, I want to hide behind this wall. The DM makes the check and they know whether you are hidden or not. You assume that you are hidden. Your character goes, I'm going to hide. I'm going to do my best to hide. To my knowledge, I am hidden, or as hidden as I could be. And it's only the GM that knows whether or not you're actually successful in that. And then we'll go into some other kind of miscellaneous questions. So Hellsent says how to modify it, especially the character development pathways and the damned culture of optimized builds. So that's kind of a two-part question. We're going to start with the first bit, modifying it. I have personally found you need to modify PF2 a lot less than you need to modify 5th edition because it has a lot more codified rules. There's a lot more written specific rules for things than there are in 5e, but modifying it is really easy. There's a whole bunch of alternate rule systems available in the Game Mastery Guide and things like Secrets of Magic that will tweak and change different things about the system, some more than others, some fundamentally change the system. If you do want to make something specific, if you want to homebrew, if you want to tweak things, if you want to change the way things work, Pathfinder is really good at giving you all the tools for how to build things. So there are specific rules for building monsters, which are the rules that the monsters in the bestiary are made with. It's not like in 5e where the rules that they say to use for monster building are different than the ones they actually use. These are the same. So if you build a monster using the monster rules in PF2, you're going to get something that is as balanced as an official monster. Same with things like items and hazards and traps and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And then when it comes to the culture of optimized builds, that is an entirely personal thing with each player. I will say that it's a lot less egregious than it was in PF1 because there's a lot fewer skill and feat trees where you have to invest in certain feats to get the one that you really want. It's a lot more open and free in that sense, but optimizers are always going to optimize. That's a player thing, not really a system thing. I do think that PF2 is quite good at discouraging optimization, the character creation process. You don't roll for stats, there's a lot less variance. You just follow the process through choosing what you want to choose, and then it gives you all your numbers at the end, meaning that you can make pretty much any kind of character that you want and you're not going to be overly penalized for it and have to optimize your way out of it. Joel says, is high level play, level 10 plus, really balanced and challenging? I don't have direct experience with high level play, but I do know a lot of people that do run PF2 and a lot of people that have experience with high level play, and I've heard nothing but good things. Because of the way the monsters and the encounters are designed, everything is built on really tight maths. So when you encounter a creature or a situation, a combat situation that is supposed to be severely difficult, it is severely difficult, and that should by and large remain all the way through the level progression. The Noogie says, best or recommended one-shots. I'm specifically looking for one-shots for experienced players of D&D and PF1 that are slowly learning PF2. So normally I would recommend the beginner's box, but if you are already experienced with D&D and PF1 and you want something that isn't quite as hand-holdy, there are a whole bunch of options. Troubles in Otari is a collection of 3 smaller adventures that leads on from that beginner's box and carries you through to I think about 4th level. There are also a number of one-shots such as A Fistful of Flowers, which is an all Leshy one-shot. Big Trouble in Little Absalom is another one. And if you go on the Paizo website, there are a whole bunch of one-shots, Pathfinder Society options, as well as bounties, they're called. The bounties in particular are designed for really short sessions, so they are quite small, self-contained usually a single level played in a single night, usually in less time than you would play for a single night. So it's a really great option to go, right, we're going to run through this for 2 hours, get familiar with the mechanics before we go into something else. CP0151 says tips for building encounters if they differ significantly from 5e. They very much do. I touched on this before, but essentially you get an encounter budget depending on the severity of the encounter. So, easy, moderate, severe. So moderate gives you 80 experience points to play with, and then how you spend those is dependent on the level of the monster in relation to the party level. So something that is the same level as the party gives 40 XP, I think it is, in a moderate encounter. And then whether it's up or down will give a different amount of XP. There's no XP tied specifically to the monster. This makes it really easy to build an encounter, but follow those rules. If it says it is severe, it is going to be severe. And especially at low levels, this can really catch the players out. So a great example of this is solo monsters. If you throw a solo monster against a party, and the solo monster is a couple levels above them, especially at the lower levels, that monster is going to hit way harder than the players are. It's not going to be like in 5th edition where the action economy kind of balances them out. That monster is going to down someone maybe immediately, maybe straight away. They might kill someone almost straight away. So just be aware that when it says severe, it means severe. And so to start with, I'd say build moderate encounters until you get a feel for the system and understand your player characters. Elliot Bolden says, how does the pacing of combat feel compared to 5th edition? It is a completely different beast. So in my experience with 5th edition, I very recently finished a campaign where we went from level 1 to 17, I think we ended up at. 5th edition is very much everyone runs up into a line, all the martial characters anyway, run up into a line, hit each other until you die. Very little movement because everything has attacks of opportunity, and most combats feel broadly the same. My experience with Pathfinder is very different in terms of players have a lot more options to play around with. Attacks of opportunity are much less universal. The fighter gets it by default, but no other class gets it by default, and most monsters don't have it. So there's a lot more movement on the battlefield. Flanking, positioning becomes much more important, and teamwork is significantly more important. So you have 3 actions each turn, but if you're going to attack, they're going to get worse with each attack. So it's almost always best for you to use that 3rd action to do something to either debuff your enemies or benefit your friends. Hope you found this video useful. If you have other questions about PF2 as a system, throw them down in the comments, and if this video is popular enough, maybe we'll make a second one answering some more questions. And if you're brand new to PF2, check out my biggest differences between PF2 and 5e video over here. But until next time, happy gaming.